Today in the studio, we're gonna learn how to dye white clay using mason stains. We're gonna go for a sage green color, like this tumbler right here. And then we're gonna head over to the pottery wheel and we're gonna throw a piece just like this, and then we'll trim it, finger paint it, we'll do all the things to it from start to finish so y'all can see the whole process. Let's get started. To dye our clay the sage green color, we're gonna need a bit of white clay, some mason stain. This one is Celeste. We'll also need a respirator, a scale that can weigh in grams, and a little container to help us weigh out our stain. You'll also want an immersion blender or a regular blender to help mix up the clay and the stain. So I have 226 grams of white clay in my container right here, and I want to color it at a 5% intensity. So if I times that by 5%, or 0.05, that gives me 11.3. That's the amount of grams of mason stain I'm going to want to add to my clay. Now, I had this bone dry clay soaking in water overnight, and I'm just gonna pour off some of the excess water because I want my slip to be a little bit chunkier and thicker because I'm ultimately gonna use it to finger paint while I'm throwing on the wheel. Now we're gonna add our Celeste mason stain to our white clay slip, and I like to wear a respirator for this part because it can get a little dusty. I'm gonna add 11.3 grams of my Celeste mason stain, and to do that, I'm gonna weigh it out in this little glass container so that I can easily pour it into my slip and then begin to mix it around. I like to start with bone dry clay and then add water to it because the weight of my clay I'm taking at the bone dry stage so that I can be more exact as I add these colors into my clays and I can achieve the exact same color over and over again. If I were to add my colors and weigh just the wet clay, the water content is always going to be a little bit different and it can make it harder to achieve the exact same color over and over again. After mixing the stain in with a wood tool, I'll use my immersion blender to get it even more blended. Mason stains are not cheap, so all of this colored clay is so valuable. I like to be sure to scrape off any bits and bobs from my immersion blender and mix it all together. The consistency I'm going for is almost like a thick yogurt because I'm going to be able to finger paint with this on the wheel as I'm throwing. You can make it thinner by adding more water or thicker by using less water. Let's head to the pottery wheel and go finger paint some tumblers. Before we head to the wheel with our new slip to go throw and finger paint our tumbler, I want to tell y'all a quick story. In the fall of 2021, I started therapy when a friend recommended BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's video. I was experiencing a lot of anxiety that was really new for me. And for the first time ever, I was experiencing travel anxiety, something that, if you know me, is very strange. I lived abroad for 4 years. I've traveled to over 12 countries. Travel was a big part of my life. And all of a sudden, I was experiencing that tight chest, anxious feeling every time I traveled. In fact, it got so bad that I was on an airplane and I had to deplane before we took off because my anxiety was so bad and I didn't think I'd be able to make it through the flight. I was terrified. BetterHelp was such a great entry point into therapy for me because I got to start with video sessions, which was so nice to do it from the privacy of my own home. My therapist helped me normalize that tight chest, hard to breathe, weight on your shoulders kind of feeling I was experiencing for the first time, and taught me a lot about my body's reaction to anxiety and how normal it is for people who are experiencing anxiety to feel these things. And then we used cognitive behavioral therapy to work through it and help me reframe my thinking and give me tools to work through the anxiety as it came up throughout my life. Last year, I went to 3 continents, including 2 solo trips to Europe. That's a long flight, and I did it all by myself, using some of those tools to help get me through when I started to feel a little anxious. But considering where I was 3 years ago, that felt nearly impossible, and here I am today. Therapy has helped me gain a stronger sense of self. I've also been able to dig deeper into my personal values, work through childhood traumas, and overall become a better communicator and have more empathy for my partner and those around me. It's also been really helpful as those big life changes inevitably occur, like leaving my full-time job to pursue pottery and art. If you're struggling with anxiety, feeling unfulfilled, or facing other challenges, I highly recommend giving BetterHelp a try. They have a network of over 30,000 licensed therapists, and if you don't feel it's the right fit in your first 1 or 2 sessions, you can easily switch therapists at no additional costs. Take that first step in prioritizing your mental health and visit betterhelp.com/CedarSun Ceramics or search Cedar Sun Ceramics at sign up for a special discount off your first month. All right, let's head back to the studio and go throw and finger paint our tumblers. Cheers! I start by throwing my tumbler on the wheel, and I'll use all of my normal throwing techniques and process to get my piece to the point where I might take it off the wheel if I were just going to glaze it afterwards, and that's where I'll start with the magic of finger painting. So enjoy this little bit of the throwing process. Now that my piece is completely thrown and I've done my best to get all of the water and slip off of the outside of it, instead of taking it off the wheel, this is when I'm going to grab for my container of sage green slip that we made earlier. I'm going to put a little bit on my middle finger and my pointer finger and begin just finger painting along the outside of the vessel. This is the fun part, so just go at random. You can go up and down, you can do polka dots, like anything you want, just have some fun with it. After I've applied a bit of color to the outside, I'll go in with my hands, which are slightly damp, and I'll just begin to gently blend the color all throughout the piece. This gives it that nice marbled look without having to use marbled clay. Then I'll go in with my same pointer finger and middle finger and add color on the inside of my piece. I find the best way to kind of blend that color on the inside is with your sponge, just kind of gently pulling it up the wall. After I've spread out the base layer of sage green slip across the piece, I like to go back into my container and grab new slip, which will be more concentrated in color because it hasn't been blended yet with my clay. And I like to add some of that to the outside of my piece, just to add that bit of depth of color. Then I'll go back in with my rib and just fine tune the shape a little bit, which will take off some of the colored slip, which I then use from my tool and reapply to my piece. I find that these two steps of getting new slip and pulling the slip off of the rib really help with getting a nice depth of color because you're going to get some really light sage green, some really dark sage green, and it's going to blend all together, giving it that fun finger painted look. When I'm happy with the shape and the design, I'll go in for the final step with my white Mud Tools sponge and just remove a bit of the excess water from the outside of the piece. This thin layer of water and slip is going to dilute the color a bit, so if you can get some of that off without distorting your piece, it's just going to bring out some of those darker, richer tones. I like to use a chamois at the end just to make sure that my rims are nice and smooth for when they're being used as tumblers in your homes. Now I'm going to remove this piece from my wheel. I like to use the Dirty Girl bat system because then I can leave my pieces on these little bat inserts to dry fully before we trim. We're back in the studio 2 days later, and now it's time to trim up our pieces. They sat on their bats for a while to get to a hard leather hard because we don't want to smear the slip at all and ruin our finger painting design. So I like to let these dry for a while before coming back to trim them. I've got my Giffin Grip Mini ready to go for our trimming day. I like to do a flat bottom on these pieces because if you begin to trim down the sides of them, you can potentially take off all of the finger painted slip that you've added. So that's why it's really important when you're throwing and finger painting your piece to get it to a point where you feel like the sides are really finished. My trimming process is pretty simple for these. I like to use a rasp tool to help me shape the sides and level out the bottom. And then I'll go in with my other tools to just clean up the little marks left from the rasp and make sure that the piece is nice and flat. After cleaning it up with my white mud tool sponge, I like to add my maker's mark on the side, and I'll use my thumb to support the piece so that I don't make an indent in the bottom. But after I take it off the Giffin Grip Mini, I also like to kind of clean up the sides and the edges, and then I'll smack it on my wheel a few times just to make sure that the bottom is nice and level and flat and didn't warp at all when I added my stamp on the side. This is what our sage green finger painted tumbler looks like all trimmed up. Now it's time to bisque fire. After the first firing in the kiln, it's time to glaze it. Now, I like to use the Amaco zinc-free clear glaze. I find that it shows the colors the brightest of everything that I've tried. So first I'll dip my piece in the bucket using the tongs, and then I move to my sponge tool, which has been soaked in water. And I like to clean off the bottoms by moving my piece across the sponge tool and then using the smaller sponge to clean up any excess glaze. That leaves it nice and clear so it won't stick to my kiln shelf. After some time in the kiln for a glaze fire, this is what our pieces look like. Here's the sage green finger painted tumblers we worked on from start to finish, coming out of the kiln, covered in our zinc-free Amaco clear glaze. If you found this video useful, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I'll be posting more videos like this with pottery tutorials and also a couple videos about running an art business and what that's really like. Cheers! See you next time in the studio.